Immigration is probably the second biggest issue after abortion libertarians disagree about. Libertarians such as Brian Kaplan believe the US should have an open borders policy even under the current welfare state and public poverty, since it will produce economic benefits, and other libertarians such as Hans-Hermann Hoppe argue that open borders are anti-libertarian, since we live under a system which consists of public poverty and would cause what Hoppe calls forced integration and violate the rights of the native peoples. Open borders advocates argue that immigrants offer economic benefits to the native peoples. Alex Nowrasteh, who is the director of immigration studies at the Cato Institute, wrote in his book titled The Most Common Arguments Against Immigration and Why They're Wrong that immigrants boost the wages of Native Americans, saying the debate over immigrants' effects on American wages is confined to the lower single percentage points. The most negative finding in the peer-reviewed academic literature was authored by Harvard University economist George Borges. He found that immigrant competition lowered the wages of native-born Americans high school dropouts by a relative 1.7% from 1990 to 2010. Borges also found that immigrants boosted the average wages of other native-born Americans, with an overall average net effect of increasing the wages of natives by about 0.6%. Gianmarco Ottaviano and Giovanni Peri came to similar results in studying the same period, with the exemption that the relative wages of native-born dropouts rose up by about 1.1%. Alex also argues later in his book that immigrants consume less in welfare than what they pay in. If native-born Americans used government benefits at the same rate and consumed the same value of benefits as immigrants, the welfare state would shrink by 43% or by more than $1.3 trillion. Another pro-immigration argument is that if the entire world had an open borders policy, world GDP would increase by about $78 trillion and would dramatically reduce world poverty, since migrants from developing countries can earn higher wages after moving to a more developed country, usually lifting them from developing world poverty to developed world poverty. They also send remittances to relatives in their home country, the flow of remittances being estimated to be around 3 times the global foreign aid spending reported by the OECD. On the other side, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, probably the most known immigration restriction libertarian, argues that as long as the state exists, the state should impose some restrictions on immigration. The reason for why he believes this is since we do not live in a society where everything is owned privately, the commons or public property create what he calls forced integration, which violates the rights of native peoples. Hoppe then argues that if all property and land was owned privately, then immigration would not be unhindered but would only occur with the consent of private property owners. The point that Hoppe makes is that open borders, unlike free trade, occurs not with mutual agreement. Hoppe makes his critical distinction between invited goods imported by a willing buyer and an individual's desire to move at will. Uninvited migration, he argues, frequently makes one party or parties, current inhabitants of the recipient nation, subjectively worse off in their view. Thus, immigration is not always analogous to trade exchanges.